Sure, the camera somewhat on the front. Thanks for coming. Tonight's finish
Johari.
Yeah. We'll call it that. Just from there. He's their strength and conditioning rowing expert. So he'll be running through some practical demonstrations as well as some theory for strength and conditioning. Enjoy. Thanks, Pat.
Cheers, Jen. Thanks for having me. As Jen said, my name is Farhan Johari. I'm the VIS lead rowing S&C coach, and I've been in this role for about 2 months, but I was also part of the rowing team, just not leading the S&C group for almost 2 years. So I've been in rowing for quite a while. I'll provide a little bit about myself and my background, so it gives you an understanding of where my philosophies come from. So there's many ways to sort of skin a cat and sort of programming. So I started off more in team-based sports, more in a bit of soccer, starting off early, more in sports science, and then transitioned more into football with the Footscray Bulldogs, where I was the assistant S&C coach towards the second and third year. So I was there for 3 years, 2015, 16 and 17. And then found my way through to the VIS after I just needed a bit of a change environment. Just wanted to learn from other S&C coaches in other sports. So I saw the institute system very beneficial for me. So I approached them and lucky enough got the gig. And then just stayed there for just over 2 years. And here I am now leading the S&C program for rowing. So I don't just only do rowing, but I also do some winter sports programs as well. So some skiers and some snowboarders. So that kind of gives a little bit of background on myself. So being more in a running-based sport to now transferring it to never running at all and rowing up and downstream has been somewhat of a challenge, but a challenge that I've found very, very good. So today's workshop, I guess, what I'll be going through, this sort of first part will be what is S&C and how it's actually integrated into rowing, how it's used in rowing, and areas that S&C can be used to help yourself or your athletes. The second part I'll go through is just some practical stuff. So we'll be just going through some warm-up strategies, some basic lifts that almost everyone can use or apply, and just some of the common errors that are normally seen with those basic lifts. And then towards the end, we'll just finish off with a Q&A at the end. So I'll probably leave about 10-15 minutes for that. So I guess the first part of this is, how does S&C work in rowing? Does anyone have any idea on how that might work? No.
Well, rowing's a strength sport. It's
Yep,
a power
correct.
sport.
Yep.
To develop the drive inside the boat, you need the strength to
Yep.
be fast.
Perfect. So, yep, correct. So you're applying a lot of force through that foot plate, through your legs, and somehow that force applied through the foot plate has to go up the chain all the way through to the oar. So what we're trying to do is trying to increase how much force you can actually produce through that foot plate and how quickly you can produce that force depending on the rate of the stroke. And then making sure that there's no leakage all the way from the foot plate to the oar. So you could have some really strong legs drive, but if you're missing some sort of puzzle, whether it be the core or something around the shoulder region, then you may be leaking some sort of energy that transfers through there. And that's what we're trying to ultimately develop, trying to improve that side of the performance. But on the other side, we're also trying to make the athlete robust. We're not trying to make them better lifters. We're not trying to improve their back squat because we want to improve just their back squat. We're trying to transfer it onto the boat, giving back time to the coach so that they can train for harder and longer on the boat. So making sure that they're robust, minimizing any sort of risk of injury. Does that make sense, or did I fly through that pretty quickly? All good? Cool. I guess the next part would be, how would you put together a program? You put together, so there's, obviously we need to make sure that they're nice and strong, make sure they're powerful, but make sure they can endure that strength and the power. So what we call strength endurance and power endurance. So we need to make sure we target all 4 of those parts at some point through the season, or depending on the philosophy of the coach, some point during that program. So this is my philosophy. So it's not just the only way that you'd program, but the way that I'd see a program would be, you do your general warm-up, go through your mobility. Obviously you need to be rowing long, rowing strong. And in order to be rowing long, you need to have very good mobility through the hamstrings, through the hips, and through the thoracic region primarily, where you're in that nice collapsed position. Yep. The next part would be to make sure that we hit all the little muscles and activate those little muscles that are going to help us row. So something around the scapular region, where you may see, and some of you might have experienced that, where after a very long row, you see that your rower might have a good arm, and then all of a sudden they're just, as they're fatigued, they start to creep up. So making sure that the scap is nice and healthy, so that we build some of the muscles around the scap so it can endure all that load, and making sure that you can stay in that position for a lot longer, rather than losing some of that energy and start to fatigue and sort of creep up. Does that all make sense? Yep. Cool. And then some other stuff would be some glute work. So so making sure that it's really strong, but making sure that it's nice and stable. So one example I'll give was, one of my rowers would be sort of sweeping, and his hips would sort of slide side to side. So he couldn't quite, how am I supposed to put this? Couldn't produce the same force at the same time through both legs. He was kind of transferring through one and then try and catch up with the other leg. So trying to find that hip stability, because that's where we found that he was sort of leaking some energy. So he'd row and kind of like wiggle his butt left and right. So
I've got a technical term for that, called jiggly bum.
Jiggly bum. All right, there we go. Jiggly bum. So that's kind of the areas that I sort of hit in the warm-up, and there's various of exercises which we'll go through some of them during the practical component.
Talking about the warm-up, and I can appreciate what it does, etc.
Yep.
Let's say you've warmed up. How long does it take for it to become unwarmed?
Oh, that's a very good question. On a day like today, probably a lot longer, but generally probably around 10 minutes, depending on the environment and obviously the weather and so forth, and the athlete.
Start your work in 10 minutes, you might as well start from scratch.
Yes, depending on the session as well. If it's a very low intensity session, they generally don't need a long warm up. But if we know that it's going to be a lot of a harder session where the muscles need to be warm, then probably restart, kick them again. So yeah, good question. So that's the warm up. I guess the next part would be, how do I sort of structure the rest of the program, or the main sets? So what I generally like to start off with is some sort of explosive movement, because it's a lot more technical to produce, depending on the exercise as well. And I sort of put the technical stuff at the start, because as they start to fatigue, it's very easy for them to lose the technical component of the exercise. So whether it be a clean, whether it be some med ball throws, whether it be a barbell squat jump. So making sure that their nervous system is firing very quickly and producing that rate of, what we call rate of force development. So where that transfers into the boat is that sort of the start from the catch, the start drive to mid drive, where you need to be able to produce those forces very quickly. So that's the explosive part, and I can give you some exercises later on. The next one would be to hit some sort of bilateral, so using both legs, lower body dominant movement that requires a high force demand. So whether it be a back squat or a deadlift, trap bar deadlift, something where you're producing a lot of force through your legs, because ultimately that's what we need to do, produce a lot of force. The next part I'd commonly do is maybe even superset that with either a core exercise or some sort of upper body exercise. So we need to make sure that we're not only just strong in the legs, but strong in the upper body. There's also been a little bit of sort of unpublished research that shows a good correlation between your 1RM bench press and having a lesser risk of rib stress fractures. Now, I don't know the whole mechanism behind that, but it's been commonly shown throughout various SSC coaches who are working in rowing within institute systems and at the NTC level as well. So generally some sort of heavy pressing movement is generally in my program. The next sort of stuff is making sure that we also hit the bilateral, so using 2 limbs, but also making sure that we use 1 limb as well. So making sure, and it's a good way, particularly for the upper body, if you are doing a unilateral upper body exercise, it's a good way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because generally when you need to use 1 arm, you're also integrating the core. Something like a cable row. Yes, you are using 1 arm, but all of a sudden you've got this anti-rotation. Depending on the coach, maybe they might want a little bit of rotation, but all of a sudden you're integrating the core. So you're making their exercise or their program a lot more efficient, particularly if they're very time poor, where there might be uni students or school kids. Also making sure when we do it unilaterally on the lower limb, making sure that they've got some good hip control. So making sure that their glute max, which is their weight onto 1 leg. All of a sudden they're using their side of the hip, which is called the glute med. And that's that sort of area that I saw with that rower that I talked about before, where his, sorry, what was that terminology again? Jiggly bum, where he had that jiggly bum. And we all of a sudden worked on some work, whether it be a single leg squat or a single leg hip hinge, and all of a sudden he was starting to strengthen up that muscle. And we could almost see over a couple of weeks, it didn't happen overnight, that his jiggly bum sort of slowly went away. So those are sort of the areas, making sure the glutes are nice and strong, hamstrings are nice and strong. And then towards the end, making sure that we also target the core, making sure it's strong, and making sure that we're targeting all four ways that the core moves. So making sure that we've got some sort of flexion, extension, rotation, and some lateral movement. But at the same time, making sure that they can resist those motions. So sometimes the main, a primary role of the core is not actually to produce movement, but to actually resist that movement. So does that all make sense when I talk about the core trying to resist movement? Yep.
How much does orientation affect it? I'm thinking, for example, when you showed the 1 arm doing that, is there much of a difference if you say doing it that way?
Yep.
Or your foot can be either that or that slightly on perspective?
That's a very good question, and it's getting a little bit more technical, but depending on the athlete, if they've got a shoulder injury, if you put them prone hold, you'll generally find that it's a lot easier for them to start to creep up. Whereas if you go to a neutral, it's a lot harder for them to actually start to creep up. So you're just teaching some good habits. So you might do that maybe with a school age kid, where you want them to make sure that they get into a good position and into a good habit before you start to challenge them in a different position. The other example that you spoke about with the foot position, turning in and out, if you put your foot narrow, you're producing the force straight down. As soon as you start to widen, you're losing a little bit of force because you're starting to produce not only down, but out. The other thing about the foot position is the wider you go, the more load you put through your adductors. The further turned out you go, same thing. But when you do turn your foot slightly out, it starts to open up the hips, and you can find that the athlete may be able to get into a deeper position. And yes, so if I was to squat with my legs parallel, toes forward, I'd come down and I'd probably start to lose my back position around there. If I go wider, slightly turn my toes out, open up those hips, I can hold that position. So you're with rowers, you want to try and get them into a narrow position because that's where they're going to produce their force. But at the same time, you need to sort of give and take because they also need to be able to get into a big position. So whenever I'm coaching the rowers I have, I always try and aim for depth because they need to be able to get into that position. Some other sports, like for footy, for instance, when I was working with them, depth wasn't the concern. It was trying to make sure that they can produce a lot of force. But I need to make sure that they can get into a deep position consistently, because it's almost like a use it or lose it rule. You either use that mobility you have, or you're going to quickly lose it. And it's very quickly to lose it, particularly if they're a uni student where they're just sitting in the lecture room or studying for long periods. So making sure that they use that mobility. But yeah, good question. And I guess after the core stuff, just making sure that they get some stretching or some cool down strategies, which may be nutrition strategies, which Elaine Bow will talk about in another workshop. But just making sure that they're stretching, making sure that they're mobilizing their hip strength, stretching the hamstring, stretching the hip flexors, stretching the thoracic region, and so forth. Does anyone have any questions before I move away from programming? No? Cool. I guess the next part would be, so we've gone through the program, but how does it actually look throughout a season? So generally across a season, what you normally do is just like with any general periodization, you start with a lot of volume and then you slowly work that volume down. With the intensity, you start with the volume low and then you slowly start to build up. And that's sort of a similar concept with the S&C stuff. So we start with a lot more volume work, making sure that they can build the work capacity, making sure that we build that tissue capacity so that they can endure those long sessions and endure the workouts that you're going to be prescribing in a couple of months' time. And then start to intensify that. So when they go from volume, start to creep up towards their 5 RMs, then the 3 RMs, then 1 RM. Once we have a good base strength, we then need to utilize that strength. So we need to make sure that they can produce that force, that high force that we've worked on, but then making sure that they can produce it quickly out on the boat. Once we've got that, which is power, we start to utilize that power over a long period. I'm not saying 6 minutes, but maybe going from 3 reps and then slowly creeping up maybe to 12 reps, 15 reps, where they have to do some sort of power endurance. So it might be 20 body weight jumps in a row and consistently produce that force. And at the VIS, I guess we're lucky enough where we've got force plates so we can sort of even track that and making sure that they're hitting those numbers. So it kind of gives them an objective feedback where a number's sort of spitting out back at them. Does that all make sense? Cool. Any questions before?
I've always got questions.
I like it.
You're going to do a serious workout and keep doing it in one particular session. At least in my experience, I know that next day when I get up, all the muscles are sort of painful and creaking and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, the question is it better to wait until it goes away before you reinstitute further work, or work on top of the pain and eventually it will go away anyway?
That's a good question, and it really depends on the context. So if they're a high performance elite athlete, maybe we'll look at the NTC level.
This is not the day before the race, this is during the race.
Then it's all right to accumulate some sort of fatigue.
Pain will give that.
Yeah. I generally say wait 48 to 72 hours, depending on the individual, and making sure if it is a really big session, the big session is probably Yeah, more than 48 hours. You can probably sneak in a lighter session, and some athletes may find that beneficial for them, getting that just the blood flowing, just the body moving, and it might even help with their recovery. So, yeah.
Makes them feel it's worthwhile.
Yeah, I've had, so if I go back to my footy experience, I've had athletes do a very light session, that is, the day after a game, and they've chucked on just a bar or an extra 10 kilos, just getting through that full range, getting the muscles moving, and all of a sudden they feel 10 times better. Some athletes don't like it, so it really comes down to the individual, where they don't really want to touch the gym at all the next day after a week.
Do you have any specific techniques to make them like it?
Ooh,
It's all right, I'll talk to you about it.
not really. No, just comes back down to the athlete. So, yeah.
So you're saying it's probably wise to do weights every second day or every third day, or
Yeah. So
if it affects you that way?
Yep. So the VIS, we structure it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and at the same time, so that we know that they're getting at least 48 hours recovery time. So yeah, and then depending on the season, or if there's any competitions coming up or any test measures that are coming up, then I might even alter the week. So it might be Monday and Friday might be heavy, and then the Wednesday might be light. Or if the test or competitions at the end of the week, then Monday and Wednesday might be heavy, or Monday might be moderate, where they're not going to be pulling up too sore for Wednesday. Wednesday can be a bigger session, and then Friday can be a light session if they've got a sort of competition on a Saturday or some sort of test measure. So. I personally, I prefer free weights, just because it teaches with machine weights, the machine's almost stabilizing your body. When you use free weights, it gives the athlete the opportunity to work on some stabilizing muscles. So, for instance, if I was to do, let's go with some sort of single leg hip hinge movement, a single leg RDL. If I did that on a Smith machine, all of a sudden it takes away some of the balance, some of that hip stability that it was on a free weight. So if I was doing a bar or a dumbbell, all of a sudden I need to control the hip stability. As soon as it's a machine, it's a lot easier for them to control because it's only moving in one direction. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, cool. Other questions?
With the machine versus free, I find the athletes usually have a better idea of what they're doing, because that machine can be constructed so, yes, it's got 200 kilo on it, but you're actually pushing 50 or so.
Yeah. But it also comes back to what they call the degrees of freedom. So if I was to tell everyone to touch your nose. You were probably the only one that did that. There's many ways for you to touch the nose. I didn't tell you how to touch your nose. You've all just went there. You could have lifted your arm, go that way. You could have lifted your arm this way, go that way. There's multiple ways that you can produce the same movement. And the same thing in the gym, there's multiple ways to produce the same movement. Now, there's obviously a more efficient and effective way, but even when you're out on the boat, maybe the athlete may be moving a millimeter different each stroke. Like I'm talking like maybe a fineness of hair, and that could be the difference between them learning the free weight movement and knowing that degrees of freedom, knowing where their body can go to when they're doing a machine weight, where the machine is controlling the movement, and all they're doing is only learning that one way to move. Good question. Very good question. Anna.
When considering strength training for younger athletes, like school age athletes, are
Yep.
there considerations we should be aware of in terms of exercise and load progression for like the younger sort of year 10s and year 11s?
Yep. That's a very good question again. So with some of the school age athletes, or if I've got any athletes that are sort of very raw and new to the gym, what I generally focus on is making sure that they can hit the basics, right? Whether it be a squat or a push-up, or making sure that they can hinge through their hip and not lose that lumbar pelvic control where they're bending through their back, making sure that they're utilizing their glutes. And we'll start to just work on the actual skill of the exercise. So with a back squat, it can just be something as simple as just a body weight squat. Once they can do that, then we can start to add load. So tucking a bar on your back or holding a dumbbell in front of you, and so forth. So we'll go from skill to load. Once they've mastered that, then we can start to make it a lot more complex and put together the skill and load. So it might be something, if they're going from a hinge motion, just learning that movement, that might be the skill. Then we start to add load where they go into an RDL, holding the barbell and adding load. They're strengthening up their hips into a skill and load movement where they might have to produce that same force a lot quicker, where they might be going into a hang clean. So same movement, RDL, and then all of a sudden into a clean where they're having to produce a lot more of a complex movement, and it's more of a timing sequencing sort of thing. Good question. Any other questions?
How much work should a 15, 16-year-old do? The sense of the thought.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, speaking just generally, it all comes down to the individual. Some are sort of like early developers and some are sort of late developers. I'd say getting 2 consistent gym sessions a week for them might be very beneficial. Now, I'm not talking about chucking 200 kilos on the bar, but making sure that they can nail down the technique. And it will help with their long-term development as well, and just their general health, making sure that they've got the longevity to row for 10 years rather than 3 years, and then all of a sudden these little niggles and injuries start popping up. So, yeah.
So do you have a difference between men and women?
No, they're pretty much produce the same movements. We've all got thighs, glutes, hamstring.
So gym sessions, the same number of sessions?
Yes. Yep. There have been a little bit of research, and I know some other S&C coaches may lighten the load depending on the time of month or something. But yeah, I haven't looked too far into that. So yeah. Yeah. Cool. No other questions. So what I'll do is, yeah, I'll grab, because there's some athletes in there, I was planning to actually utilize the gym area, but there's athletes in there. So what I'll do is we'll grab a barbell and I'll come and bring it out, and I'll just go through some basic exercises that are commonly used across multiple rowing clubs, and just some of the common areas that you might see. So I'll quickly run and grab it. Sorry. So what we'll do is we'll start off with how I actually structured the program. So we'll start from the top. We'll go with the warm-up. Some mobility exercises that I commonly use. We'll start from the bottom down and work with the hips and hamstrings. You can just do your general hamstring stretch on the ground, target your hamstrings. Everyone knows that. Some hip exercises that I like to use are just casual, just knee hug, figure 7 glute, if they can get into that position. An exercise for that is you can just do a push-up scat. So pressing your chest away from the ground, then relaxing. Pressing away, then relaxing. Pressing away, then relaxing. Cool. So those are some of the mobilizing exercises and activation exercises that I sort of use with my athletes. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to some of the main lifts? No? All right. So we'll start off with some explosive movements. Nice and simple, barbell squat jump, so you can have the rod or barbell on your back. Making sure that you keep the chest up, down, and then straight up, down, straight up. So that's obviously a singular counter movement jump. And as you get later into that power endurance block of your season, then they can start to do more of a power endurance where they're producing that power repetitively. So I'll try to go for 10. There we go. 1, 2. So that was 10. So some athletes may want to, depending on your athlete, may produce a few more reps. But did anyone find anything wrong with that movement? In particular for rowers. So what? Pardon?
You had bent knees when you landed, which I think is good, but that's not saying that's right. You
Just
had
probably,
straight knees, I would say that.
no, what I didn't do is for rowers, because they need to be able to produce force from the catch position, a counter movement jump of going into a quarter squat position might be not as effective. If you can do a counter movement jump from a deeper position, then all of a sudden they're producing force from a deeper position rather than going into a quarter squat. So it's a quarter squat I might use for my footy players, whereas rowers, remember, the use it or lose it rule. Use that mobility, get nice and deep, then produce the force. But making sure that they've got the mobility. Now this is just a dowel rod. If they were to have load on their back, making sure that they've got the mobility to get into that deep position. Does that all make sense? Cool. So that's more of a pushing motion. Some other exercises you can use is a med ball scoop. So having a med ball hinging through your hips and sewing it up if you've got the space to use it. Obviously, if you've got a roof, then it's a bit harder to do. So those are some of the explosive exercises that I normally use.
What do you recommend as far as shoes in the gym?
No shoes in the gym.
What do you recommend as shoes?
Oh, as shoes in the gym. If they've got the resources and they're financially stable to afford it, maybe some weightlifting shoes. But that being said, their heel's a little bit, in a weightlifting shoe, their heel's a bit chopped. With a rower, you don't necessarily want them to be heel shocked because then they're not getting through their full ankle mobility. When you're on the foot plate, you want to make sure that you're nice and collapsed and making sure that there's a knee to wall test that Rowing Australia use. I can't remember the minimum number they need to achieve. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on this. It may be 14, but it's a knee to wall test. So you'd have a ruler or a tape that has some sort of measurement, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, all the way to 20 centimeters. Starting with your foot close to the wall, try and get your knee to touch the wall while you move back without letting that heel rise. So as soon as that heel rise, you get the number that you were able to achieve that without your heel rising. So that goes back. Maybe it might be beneficial that they have a flatter shoe.
That would be an excellent way of actually measuring your flexibility as the season progresses.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So we've had an athlete that's had an ankle issue in the past, and he does that consistently every gym session to make sure that he's staying on top of it. But yeah, good question. Back to the bilateral strength. So something to produce a lot of force. Now, the most commonly one every club will go to is some sort of squatting movement. So if I go and start back maybe to what Anna said, what do you do for the school age rowers? You can go to a nice and simple body weight squat. nice and easy. Making sure some common errors that you might see might be they might be going too far forward, starting to go on their toes. Maybe they just don't have the glute strength to actually sit back in the squat. With the squat motion, the further you go forward, the more load you put through your knees. The further you go back, the more load you put through your glutes because you're in that deeper hip flexion. So it really comes down to the S&C coach and the philosophy and what they're trying to achieve. So there's, you can go two ways about that. Some common areas might be the butt tacking, or the other common one, which transfers into the boat. When someone squats, making sure that their hips and shoulders rise together and making sure that their hips don't shoot up first, and then they're trying to achieve that motion. That comes into the boat where they're sort of losing that connection from the foot plate to the yaw, and their butt side starts to slide first before they start to move the yaw, making sure that they can drive that shoulder and hip and control that force, transfer that force through to the yaw and through their legs, and their shoulders and hips move together before they have the body rock over. Cool. So that's a squat motion. A hinge motion would be sort of a deadlift or an RDL. Most common error, and I'm sure most of you have seen, is when you do the RDL, the hinge motion, just making sure that the athlete, particularly with the younger one, that they're not getting the hinge through their back, and then you want that hinge through the hips so you load up the glutes. Some common errors is they might have the rod out there and not closer to the body. Now, when I'm coaching an athlete, you want the rod to be nice and close to the body. Does anyone have any ideas on why you might want that? If something was, if I was to pick up something out there compared to there, what's easier to pick up? Closer to the body, because it's closer to the midline and the center of mass of your body. So if they're out there, all of a sudden it's making it a lot harder, and it's shifting the weight away from the center of mass. So you want to kind of keep it in line with the center of mass, which should be around their midfoot, or just keep the bar close to the body. Some athletes may not have developed that skill yet to be able to hold the rod or barbell close to their legs. Maybe they just don't have the lat strength, or maybe just can't understand the skill. What I generally use, particularly with some development athlete, is if you've got some band or a TheraBand, or maybe even a towel, anything you can find, if you're standing away from the athlete in front of them and you're trying to pull that rod away, it gives them a cue so that they can put some tension on the band, and all of a sudden they're trying to pull that band, and it keeps them nice and close to the body. Cool. All right. Some single leg exercises. Most sort of basic one we can sort of use. Grabbing a chair, doing a normal squat to the chair, but all of a sudden going on one leg and making sure they can go down and all the way up. Down and all the way up. Some common errors that you might see is when they're going down, their knee starts to shift in, which puts them at risk of some sort of knee injury, but it also just shows that they don't have quite that glute strength to push and pull that knee out. So the glute does three movements. It extends through the hips, it abducts through the hips, and it also rotates the hips. And that sort of rotation movement is what helps keeps the knees out. So when you're doing that single leg squat, make sure you're keeping that knee out. The other common error is if I was to go this way, and if you look from the back, making sure that they've got that good hip stability. Once they transfer their weight onto, so my right, if I'm transferring it onto my right leg, the main leg, making sure that that free hip doesn't drop and tilt out, and they're not using that glute med. Some of them may not lose it at the top. Some of them may lose it as they're coming down. to sort of shift that hip out. So what you want to see is making sure